Thanks so much, Connie. Sorry about the popping. We tried to figure out what was going on with that. We thought we had it solved. Should I go over? All right. So, okay, we're good now. It's wonderful to be in worship and to continue this series of timeless wisdom. And in these few minutes, I just want to lift up one of the images that we find in the wisdom literature, in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, all the wisdom literature we find in the Hebrew Scriptures that's echoed in Jesus' teaching and in the other writings in the New Testament as well. We began early in this service with reading the words of Psalm 1. The very first psalm has this image of being rooted. And it says that those who delight in the law of the Lord, those who embrace the teachings of God, are like trees that are planted by streams of water, and they put down deep roots, and they bear fruit, and the leaves do not wither. Jesus picks up on this in his parable that's usually called the parable of the sower. Parable of the sower. And that parable really is not well named. It's not really a focus on the sower. The sower is important. The extravagance of the sower certainly stands out. We might even say the wastefulness of the sower, because the sower is broadcasting seeds just everywhere. On good soil and the not so good soil, they just fall everywhere. Extravagant broadcasting of the seeds. But it's not really focused on the sower, and it's not really focused on the seeds. So calling it the parable of the seeds really doesn't work either, because the parable really is not about the seeds that are all the same. They're all good seeds. But it's really about the distinction among the soils. It's probably the parable of the soils. Now, when I was a kid, I remember I had a teacher that would correct me when I said dirt for some reason. She didn't like dirt. Where I grew up, it was dirt, right? But she would say, no, we call it soil. I can remember that. So you could call it the parable of the dirt, but we're calling it the parable of the soils. And it's different kinds of soils. And it represents how open one is to receiving God's love and God's grace, and the call and the challenge of God on our lives. That's what the soils are about. And it's not as though we're all of one kind of soil or another. It's not as though in any given time in our life we might be mostly one kind of soil, but that can change over time depending on the season of our lives. And it's not as though every aspect of our life is the same. So keep that in mind as we think about these soils. The parable of the soils, there are 4 kinds of soil that Jesus talks about. The first is the hard beaten path. If you can picture in your mind's eye fields that are plowed up, not in rows like we're used to, but just plowed up, and the sower would come and broadcast the seeds all over the fields. And some of the seeds would fall on these hard beaten paths that run between the fields. They're almost like concrete. They're beaten hard by the foot traffic between the fields. And some of the seed fall there, and the birds come and eat them. There's no way the seed can get into the soil to take root. There are seasons in our lives, there are places in our lives, too, where we're like that hard-packed soil. Sometimes beaten down by difficulties and stresses and problems, like a beaten path. Sometimes we can find ourselves becoming kind of cynical about the world and build a shell around ourselves. We can become like that hard-packed path so that we're suspicious of the motives of others. We close ourselves off to receiving the good news of God's love and God's grace and the challenge and the call of God on our lives. We can be, in some places in our lives, closed off in that way to God's grace and love. And so we can be like that soil at different times, different places. We can also be like the soil, the second soil that Jesus describes, and it's the rocky soil. A year and a half ago, Susan and I bought a house out near Eagle Mountain Lake. And if you live out near Eagle Mountain Lake, you know what rocky soil is. When we moved in, there was almost no grass in the front yard. And when it rained, what we grew in the front yard were rocks. They would just sort of come up, it seemed like, out of the ground as there was almost no topsoil. That's what Jesus is describing, very thin layer of soil. There's an old Arab story that when God created the world, that God sent two angels out with big sacks containing all the rocks that the world would contain. And when over what we now refer to as the area of Palestine, one of the sacks broke and half of the rocks intended for the whole world ended up there. And Jesus' hearers would have understood that and understood what rocky soil was about. And nothing really grows there. If we had not done anything with our yard and we had simply scattered seeds on the yard, they might have germinated, but when we hit the first 95-degree day, they would have wilted. That's the image Jesus has. That's the image of that kind of burst of enthusiasm that we might have yes, I understand God's love and God's grace, and yes, I'm going to be God's person in the world, and we have great enthusiasm about that, and then the heat comes, and the difficulties come, and if there's no depth there, we can find that our faith begins to wither, and that can happen. It can happen in different seasons of our lives, for all of us. It can happen sometimes in different areas of our life as well. For me, when I think about that enthusiasm for a new piece of exercise equipment. Do you know that? This is going to revolutionize my life. I'm going to be healthy. This is going to be great. And you get the thing set up and you start using it and it's just hard. And it's just difficult. And so pretty soon, when the difficulty comes, it becomes a clothes rack, And it's that way sometimes in this realm of faith, this realm of God's call and God's challenge in our lives in Christ. And so there's that kind of soul. And then the one that I guess troubles me most of all, the one that challenges me most of all, is the thorny soil. It's where the thorns grow up, Jesus says, from that thorny soil with the crops. And the problem is they grow a little bit faster and they're more aggressive and they can choke out the seeds of faith that have sprouted. That one's a challenge for me. The noise, the distractions, those things that are going on that take my emotions in one way or the other. And I can find if I allow those they can become more and more and more a part of my life and can weaken my sense of God's love and God's grace and the challenge and the call of God on my life. Have you ever experienced that? The thorny soil. There's so much that calls for our attention, and that can crowd out that which is most important. And then, of course, there's the good soil. It's those times and those places in our life where we have really, as Mr. Mark said, we've prepared. We have practiced the disciplines of our faith, and worship and study and fellowship and giving and serving and praying and more we find that our lives are open to receiving this wonderful news of the grace and the love of God and Christ and the call and the challenge on our lives. And that's represented by the good soil. And the seed takes root and it grows and it yields fruit. It's the fruitfulness of life that comes from this open heart and life. For opening those places in our lives where we might want to protect and close off, opening those to God so that God can be at work in us and through us. And our lives bear fruit. And the fruit that our lives bear is powerful. The power of growth. I was thinking about that a lot this week. I remember, how many of you had the experience in school of having the little paper cup with the soil in it and the seed pressed down in it, and you put it in the window sill? You know what I'm talking about? And it sprouts. And to watch the power of that little seed becoming something else and becoming so much greater than it started out is astounding. I can still remember it as a child. I can remember experiencing it all over again with our daughters as they experienced that in school as well. The power of a seed to grow and to flourish and to bear fruit. About 10 or 12 years ago, they discovered some date palm seeds at Masada. Archaeologists discovered them and they germinated. And there is now a type of date palm tree that was extinct that now lives. The tree is over 10 feet tall now because of the germination of the seeds. Those seeds were carbon dated. They are 2,000 years old. 2,000 years the seeds lay dormant and then they germinated. The power of life within them. And so it is with this good news of our faith, the power to transform and to make new and to bear fruit. And the wisdom of the ages calls us to open our lives to God, that we might bear fruit as we are God's people in the world. And that's risky to do. It takes some risk to open ourselves in that way. It takes some risk to begin to take the fruitfulness of our own life and to share it with others, whether that's our time or talents, our money, whatever it is. It takes some risk to do that. But it's that risk that ultimately bears fruit. It's like that old story of the farmer who's sitting out on his front porch and somebody comes by and says, "How's your cotton crop?" He said, "I didn't plant any cotton. Afraid of boll weevils." "Well, how about your corn? How's your corn?" "No, didn't plant any corn. Afraid of drought." "Well, what about potatoes?" "No, afraid of potato bugs. Didn't plant potatoes." "Did you plant anything?" "No, I just played it safe," he said. Playing it safe is not very fruitful. And sometimes out of fear, we can play it too safe. And that compromises the fruitfulness of our lives. So it's my prayer for you and for me as we go from this place, that we would go as God's people in the world, to open our lives in such a way that we would bear fruit. Amen.